The bell tower stood silent against the pale morning sky, its bronze tongue frozen mid-swing as if time itself had forgotten how to move forward. Father Michael pressed his palm against the cold stone of St. Catherine as outer wall and felt nothing, no warmth, no pulse, no whisper of the divine presence that once made these walls hum with purpose. 3 months had passed since the last Mass. 3 months since the diocese recalled him along with every other priest in the archdiocese. 3 months since the churches began their slow transformation into monuments of abandonment. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The city had 17 churches once, scattered like seeds across its neighborhoods, each one an anchor point in the spiritual geography of the community. Now they sat empty, locked but not quite forgotten, their parking lots gathering leaves and their bulletin boards still displaying service times that would never come. The shortage hadn't arrived suddenly like a plague or a war. It had crept in slowly over decades, a tide withdrawing grain by grain until one morning the shore lay bare, and everyone wondered how they failed to notice the water disappearing. Michael walked the perimeter of St. Catherine's, his breath forming small clouds in the October air. He'd been reassigned to St. Dominic's across town, one of the 3 remaining churches the diocese deemed sustainable. 3 churches to serve 17 neighborhoods. 3 priests to cover what once required 20. The math couldn't work, but the diocese insisted this was temporary, a strategic consolidation until vocations recovered. Michael had stopped believing in that recovery, the way he'd stopped believing in many things lately, quietly and without announcement, the faith simply absent one morning when he reached for it. A woman stood at the church's front steps, elderly and bent, her hand resting on the iron railing. She wore a floral dress despite the chill, and her other hand clutched a rosary with beads worn smooth by decades of prayer. Michael recognized her Mrs. Kowalski, a daily Mass attendee, one of the faithful whose devotion had been so constant he'd sometimes taken it for granted. "Father," she said when she saw him, her voice carrying relief and accusation in equal measure. "I've been coming every morning. The door's still locked. I know, Mrs. Kowalski. I'm sorry. But it's Sunday." "I know. So why isn't the church open? Why isn't there Mass?" Michael had answered this question so many times the words came automatically now, smooth and hollow as river stones. The diocese has consolidated services. Sunday Mass is at St. Dominic's at 9 and 11, and there's a Saturday vigil at 5. St. Mark's has a Sunday evening service at 6, and St. Dominic's is 4 miles away, she interrupted. "I don't drive anymore. My daughter works Sundays. You know this. You know I've been coming to this church for 53 years. I was married here. My children were baptized here. My husband's funeral was here. I understand, and I'm truly sorry, but no, you don't understand." Her grip tightened on the rosary. "This is my church. This is where God lives for me. You can't just lock him away and tell me to go somewhere else." Michael wanted to tell her that God didn't live in buildings, that the divine presence wasn't bound by brick and mortar, that faith was portable and transcendent and could flourish anywhere. But he'd tried those words before with others and watched them land like stones, cold comfort that provided no comfort at all. Because Mrs. Kowalski was right in ways that theological abstraction couldn't address. This was her church, her spiritual home, the place where her religious identity had been formed and sustained across decades. Telling her to simply transfer that elsewhere was like telling someone their childhood home didn't matter because houses were interchangeable. "Would you like me to arrange a ride for you to St. Dominic's?" He offered. "I can talk to the parish council about transportation." She stared at him with an expression that seemed to age her further, pulling her features down with disappointment. "I don't want a ride to another church, Father. I want this church. I want what was promised to me when I joined this parish, when I raised my family here, when I put money in the collection basket every single week for 53 years. I want the church to keep its promises." She turned and descended the steps slowly, each movement careful and measured, her rosary swinging gently at her side. Michael watched her walk away down the empty street, past the shuttered pharmacy, and the for-lease sign in what used to be the hardware store, and he felt the weight of a system collapsing not dramatically, but incrementally, leaving people like Mrs. Kowalski stranded in the debris. Inside St. Dominic's an hour later, the pews filled quickly for the 9 o'clock Mass, not with the quiet satisfaction of a healthy parish, but with the anxious compression of too many people squeezed into too little space. Families who'd never met sat shoulder to shoulder. Children accustomed to running freely in their own spacious churches fidgeted in the cramped quarters. The music director struggled to blend 3 different parish choirs into something resembling harmony. Everyone was displaced, everyone was making do, and the strain showed in tight smiles and clipped conversations. Michael vested in the sacristy, pulling the alb over his head and securing the cincture around his waist. Father Thomas, the pastor of St. Dominic's, moved through his own preparations with practiced efficiency, his movements sharp and economical. He was older than Michael by 15 years, gray-haired and lean, with the wiry endurance of someone who'd learned to survive on less. "Full house again," Thomas said, adjusting his stole. "We're going to need to add another Mass. We can barely staff the ones we have now. I know. I'm just stating facts, not solving problems. That's apparently above my pay grade." There was an edge to Thomas's voice that Michael had noticed growing sharper over recent months. The consolidation had hit him hardest, transforming his manageable parish into an overcrowded refugee camp for displaced Catholics. He'd lost autonomy, gained chaos, and received no additional resources to manage the change. "Any word from the diocese about reopening St. Catherine's?" Michael asked, knowing the answer, but needing to voice the question. "None. They're talking about selling it. St. Catherine's, St. Joseph's Holy Name selling them to cover legal settlements and pension obligations. Apparently, the Archdiocese is more broke than they've been letting on. They can't sell them. Those are parishes, not properties." Thomas laughed, a dry sound without humor. "They're both, Michael, always have been. The faithful just prefer we emphasize the spiritual aspect." The comment stung because it was true. A church existed simultaneously as sacred institution and legal corporation, as mystical body and property holder, and those dual identities didn't always align. Michael had known this intellectually since seminary, but living it was different. Watching buildings he'd been taught to revere reduced to line items on a balance sheet felt like witnessing a kind of spiritual fraud. They processed into the church together, the opening hymn already underway, and Michael took his place beside the altar. He looked out at the congregation and saw it clearly, the fragmentation. This wasn't a parish. It was several parishes awkwardly merged, their distinct identities still visible in the clustering patterns and the subtle, territorial markers people established even in temporary spaces. The families from St. Catherine's sat on the left side, near the back. The Holy Name contingent occupied the right side pews toward the front. The original St. Dominic's members held the center, slightly resentful of the invasion. The Mass proceeded with mechanical precision. Michael had said these words so many times they'd become autonomous, his mouth producing the liturgy while his mind wandered. He thought about Mrs. Kowalski walking away from her locked church. He thought about the 17 buildings sitting empty across the city, their altars cold and their sanctuaries dark. He thought about the slow-motion collapse of an institutional structure that had seemed permanent, discovering too late that permanence was an illusion sustained by continuous human effort. During the homily, Father Thomas spoke about community and adaptation, about the early Christians meeting in homes when they lacked proper churches, about faith persisting through persecution and displacement. It was a careful message meant to comfort and inspire, to reframe loss as opportunity. Michael watched the congregation receive it politely, but without enthusiasm. They didn't want homilies about early Christian flexibility. They wanted their churches back. They wanted the world to stop changing in ways that made them feel obsolete. After Mass, the church emptied slowly, people lingering in small groups to exchange updates and complaints. Michael stood near the entrance, shaking hands and accepting comments that ranged from grateful to hostile. A middle-aged man from Holy Name told him the music was too contemporary. A young mother from St. Catherine's asked if there would ever be a family Mass again, something child-friendly. An elderly couple he didn't recognize simply informed him they'd be looking for a different church, somewhere less crowded, maybe the Episcopalians. That last comment caught Michael off guard. "I hope you'll reconsider. I know this is an adjustment, but—" "It's not an adjustment, Father," the man said. "It's abandonment. The church gave up on our neighborhood. So we're giving up on the church." They left before Michael could respond, and he wasn't sure what he would have said anyway. How did you argue against abandonment when the evidence surrounded you? How did you ask people to remain faithful to an institution that seemed to have lost faith in them? The afternoon brought administrative meetings, budget reviews, and planning sessions for the consolidated schedule. The 3 remaining priests gathered in St. Dominic's conference room. Michael, Thomas, and Father Raymond, a newly ordained priest whose youth and enthusiasm felt increasingly out of place. The diocese had sent Raymond as reinforcement, one fresh recruit expected to offset the loss of 17 veterans who de-retired or died in the past 5 years without replacement. Raymond spread a proposed schedule across the table, color-coded and optimistic. If we coordinate carefully, we can cover daily Mass at all 3 churches, plus 2 weekend Masses at each location. That gives us 6 Sunday Masses total, which should accommodate everyone. Thomas studied the schedule with the expression of someone being shown a perpetual motion machine. "Raymond, when do we sleep in this scenario?" "Well, the Masses are staggered, so—" "When do we eat? When do we prepare homilies? When do we visit the sick? When do we handle counseling, administration, sacramental preparation, staff meetings, and the 1,000 other things parish ministry requires?" I thought we could share responsibilities more efficiently. Maybe train lay ministers to handle some. We're already using lay ministers for everything except the Mass itself. We have Eucharistic ministers, lectors, music directors, religious education coordinators, RCIA leaders, and pastoral associates all filling gaps. But they can't consecrate the Eucharist. They can't hear confessions or anoint the dying. And there are only 3 of us. Raymond's enthusiasm dimmed, his color-coded schedule suddenly looking less like a solution and more like a wishful diagram of an impossible situation. Michael felt sympathy for him. Raymond had entered seminary believing in a church that no longer existed, trained for a role that was vanishing even as he prepared to fill it. He'd been ordained into a crisis. "Maybe we need to reconsider the model entirely," Michael said. "What if we don't try to maintain the old structure? What if we develop something new?" "Such as?" Thomas asked. "I don't know exactly. But the current approach isn't sustainable. We're running faster and faster to stay in the same place, and we're still falling behind. Maybe instead of trying to be everywhere, we focus our presence differently. More lay leadership, more decentralized worship, priest as occasional visitor rather than constant presence." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "So we become the clergy equivalent of circuit riders. Traveling preachers who stop by occasionally to administer sacraments. If that's what the situation requires. The diocese will never approve it. Too radical. Too much admission that we're failing. We're already failing. We're just pretending otherwise." The room fell silent. Raymond looked uncomfortable, probably wondering if this kind of frank assessment was normal, or if he'd walked into a particularly dysfunctional assignment. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, exhaustion etched into every line. "You're not wrong," Thomas finally said. "But knowing we're failing and having permission to try something different are separate things. The institution doesn't change easily, especially not in ways that acknowledge its own decline." They spent another hour working through Raymond's schedule, making adjustments and compromises that rendered it slightly less impossible, but no more sustainable. By the time they finished, the solution pleased no one, but seemed marginally better than having no plan at all. It was, Michael thought, a perfect metaphor for the entire situation. Inadequate responses to overwhelming problems. Everyone doing their best, while knowing their best wasn't enough. That evening, Michael drove through the city as darkness settled. He passed St. Catherine's, its stained glass windows dark and lifeless. He passed Holy Name, where someone had spray-painted, "God has left the building," across the front doors. He passed St. Joseph's, where the parking lot had become an informal homeless encampment, people seeking shelter in the shadow of an abandoned sanctuary. Each empty church told the same story, an institution that had overextended, building more structures than it could maintain, training more priests than it could replace, making promises it couldn't keep. The shortage wasn't just about vocations. It was about sustainability, about an organizational model designed for growth encountering an era of contraction. Michael pulled into the parking lot of a convenience store and sat in his car, engine running, heat blowing against the cold. He thought about Mrs. Kowalski's question, "Why can't we keep our church?" And the honest answer he couldn't give her. Because maintaining 17 churches required 17 priests, plus all the supporting infrastructure, and that system had collapsed. Because the money wasn't there. Because the vocations weren't there. Because the institutional church had been built for a different era and had unadapted fast enough when that era ended. His phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. Mrs. Chun, one of his parishioners, was in the ICU after a stroke. Family requesting last rites. Michael put the car in gear and headed across town, trying to remember which hospital, which floor, which patient among the many he was supposed to know and serve. The knowledge that he was forgetting people, losing track of needs, becoming a less effective minister despite working harder than ever, that knowledge sat heavy in his chest. Mrs. Chun lay unconscious when Michael arrived. Her family gathered around the bed in the small private room. They greeted him with relief and gratitude, making space at the bedside. He administered the sacrament of anointing of the sick, making the sign of the cross on her forehead and hands with blessed oil, speaking the ancient prayers in both English and Spanish at the family's request. They prayed together, the family's voices joining his, and for a moment the purpose of his vocation felt clear again. "Thank you for coming, Father," Mrs. Chun's daughter said afterward. "We weren't sure if you'd be available. We know you're covering so many parishes now." "Of course I came. Mrs. Chun is part of our community. She loved St. Catherine's. She was heartbroken when it closed." Michael nodded, unable to find adequate words. He stayed with the family for another 20 minutes, offering what comfort he could, then drove home through the dark city. It was past 9 when he reached the rectory, the small house he now shared with Father Thomas. Raymond had been assigned a room at the Diocesan Pastoral Center, some cost-saving measure that meant the youngest priest had the longest commute. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and a stack of financial reports. He glanced up when Michael entered. "Hospital call?" "Yeah, Mrs. Chun from St. Catherine's. Stroke. How is she?" "Not good. Family's hopeful, but it didn't look promising." Thomas pushed the whiskey bottle toward Michael, an invitation. Michael poured a small amount into a glass and sat down across from him. "I've been going through the parish financials," Thomas said, "trying to figure out how we're going to pay for everything with 3 buildings instead of 1. The math is worse than I thought." "How bad?" "Each church has its own operating costs, utilities, maintenance, insurance. St. Dominic's was built to serve 300 families. We're now trying to serve 1,100. The building can't handle it. We need a new HVAC system, expanded parking, additional restrooms. That's $200,000 minimum, and the diocese has no money to help. Can't we fundraise? From which parish? The St. Dominic's families resent the consolidation. The displaced families are angry about losing their churches. And everyone's being asked to give more while receiving less. It's not exactly an ideal fundraising environment. Michael sipped the whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat. What if we close one of the remaining churches? Consolidate further. Then we'd have 2 churches serving 17 neighborhoods, and even more people displaced. At some point, we're not providing service, we're managing decline. Maybe that's what we are doing. Maybe that's what the priesthood has become in this era, managing decline. Thomas smiled, but it was a sad expression. You're getting cynical, Michael. That happens to all of us eventually, but you're young for it. I'm being realistic. Realism and cynicism look very similar from certain angles. They sat in silence for a while. 2 priests drinking whiskey at a kitchen table, the institutional weight of centuries pressing down on their shoulders. Michael thought about seminary, about the vision of priesthood he'd embraced during formation. He'd imagined being a spiritual father to a community, presiding over masses and marriages and baptisms, providing guidance and comfort, being a visible presence of God's love in the world. Instead, he'd become an administrator, a scheduler, a crisis manager shuttling between buildings and trying to maintain systems that were fundamentally broken. Do you ever regret it? Michael asked. Choosing this life? Thomas considered the question carefully, rolling his glass between his palms. No, but I regret what it's become. I regret what we're asking people to accept. I regret that I can't be the priest I thought I'd be because the circumstances won't allow it. Do you think it will get better? Honestly? No. I think it will get worse before it gets better, if it gets better at all. The vocations aren't coming. The money isn't coming. The cultural support isn't coming. We're presiding over something that's ending, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. The honesty was bracing, like cold water on skin. Michael had suspected these truths, but hearing them spoken aloud by someone with Thomas's experience made them feel more real, more unavoidable. So what do we do? Michael asked. We keep doing what we're doing. We serve the people who are still here. We administer the sacraments. We try to be faithful to our vows, even as the institution crumbles around us. And we hope that whatever emerges from this collapse will be better than what we're losing. It wasn't an inspiring answer, but it felt true. Michael finished his whiskey and stood up. I'm going to bed. Early Mass tomorrow. Every morning, Thomas said. Forever and ever, amen. Michael smiled despite himself and headed upstairs to his room. He changed into sleep clothes and sat on the edge of his bed, too tired to pray, but too restless to sleep. His phone showed 3 missed calls and a handful of text messages, all people needing something: a sick parishioner, a couple wanting to schedule a baptism, someone asking about confession times, someone else wanting to know why their church was closed. He turned off the phone and lay in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around him. Somewhere across the city, 17 churches sat empty, their bells silent, their doors locked. Somewhere Mrs. Kowalski was probably lying awake too, wondering what she'd done to deserve abandonment. Somewhere Mrs. Chan's family kept vigil, hoping for recovery, grateful at least that a priest had been available when needed. And somewhere, Michael supposed, were the missing priests, the hundreds who'd retired or died or left ministry, the thousands who'd never been called or ordained, the absent multitudes whose absence had created this crisis. He wondered about them sometimes, wondered what combination of cultural shifts and institutional failures had led to this moment. But wondering didn't change anything. The shortage was real. The consolidation was real. The decline was real. The next morning brought a funeral at St. Mark's, one of the 3 remaining churches. Michael concelebrated with Raymond, the young priest earnestly performing his duties with a kind of bright-eyed devotion that felt both admirable and naive. The deceased was a man Michael had never met, a parishioner from one of the closed churches who died before establishing roots in a new parish. The family seemed disconnected from the service, going through expected motions in an unfamiliar space with priests who hadn't known their loved one. During the eulogy, Michael spoke about resurrection and hope, about the promise of eternal life and the comfort of faith. He believed these words in some abstract theological sense, but their connection to the current situation felt tenuous. What comfort was eternal hope when temporal community had been destroyed? What did resurrection mean to people watching their spiritual homes die? After the burial, as mourners dispersed, an older man approached Michael. He wore a suit that had seen better days and carried himself with the cautious dignity of someone used to being dismissed. "Father, I wonder if you have a moment." "Of course. What can I do for you?" "I'm Peter Walsh. I used to be a priest." The statement hung in the air between them. Michael had met a handful of former priests during his ministry, men who'd left for various reasons: marriage, loss of faith, disillusionment, burnout. They often carried a mixture of guilt and defensiveness, as if expecting judgment. "Nice to meet you, Peter. What parish were you assigned to?" "Several, over the years. My last was St. Anne's, about 20 miles from here. I left the priesthood in 1998. What brings you to this funeral?" "The deceased was a cousin of mine. But I also wanted to talk to someone about what's happening with the churches. I've been watching it from the outside, and it's heartbreaking. It's not easy from the inside either." Peter smiled, a knowing expression. "I imagine not. But from where I stand, it looks like a system eating itself, trying to maintain a structure that's no longer sustainable rather than adapting to new realities." "That's a fair assessment. I left because I couldn't reconcile what I believed the church should be with what it actually was. Too much hierarchy, too much control, too much emphasis on maintaining institutional power rather than serving people. I thought maybe things would change over time, become more flexible, more responsive. But instead, it seems like everything's just contracted and hardened." Michael felt defensive, despite agreeing with much of what Peter said. The church has survived 2,000 years. It's weathered worse crises than this. Has it? I'm not so sure. The church survived as an institution, yes, but how many people did it lose along the way? How many communities were destroyed? How much damage was done by prioritizing institutional survival over human needs? So what's your solution? We should just let it all collapse? No, but maybe we need to accept that collapse is happening whether we want it or not. And instead of desperately trying to preserve a dying model, we should be thinking about what comes next. What does church look like with fewer priests? With fewer buildings? With less centralized control? You're describing something that barely resembles Catholicism. I'm describing something that might resemble early Christianity. Small communities, lay leadership, flexible structures. The model we've been using: professional clergy, hierarchical control, expensive infrastructure, that's only a few centuries old. It's not divinely mandated. It's just one way of organizing religious community among many possible ways. A few other mourners were waiting to speak with Michael, and he could feel his window for this conversation closing. But Peter's words nagged at him, raising questions he'd been avoiding. "I appreciate your perspective," Michael said, "but I'm not in a position to redesign the church. No one person is. But everyone who participates in it shapes what it becomes. And right now, by working yourself to exhaustion, trying to maintain an unsustainable system, you're choosing a particular path forward. What choice do I have? These are my vows. This is my calling. Your calling is to serve God and community. The specific institutional form that's negotiable. But the institution prefers you not realize that. Peter shook Michael's hand and walked away, leaving Michael standing among the gravestones, feeling unsettled. The conversation had articulated doubts that had been forming slowly in his mind, giving them shape and voice in ways that felt both clarifying and threatening. The afternoon brought a wedding at St. Dominic's, a young couple Michael had prepared during a truncated marriage prep process. With the consolidation, he'd been handling 3 times as many sacramental preparations with the same amount of time, which meant everyone got less attention. The couple seemed happy despite the rushed process, focused on their celebration rather than the institutional chaos surrounding it. Michael performed the ceremony with practiced ease, speaking the familiar words about love and commitment, about sacred bonds and divine blessing. The church was full of guests dressed in their best clothes, the mood festive and hopeful. For a few hours, the crisis seemed distant. This was what church was supposed to be: gathering people for important moments, blessing transitions, creating sacred space for life's milestones. But after the ceremony, as the wedding party and guests moved to the reception hall, Michael returned to the empty church and felt the weight return. This building would host 3 more weddings this month, plus 2 funerals, dozens of masses, countless meetings and events. It was being used beyond capacity, stressed by demands it was never designed to meet. How long before something broke? How long before the strain became unsustainable? That evening, Michael attended a pastoral council meeting where representatives from the displaced parishes aired their grievances. The mood was tense, the complaints familiar. People wanted their churches reopened. They wanted adequate service times. They wanted priests who knew their names and their families. They wanted what they'd had before, and no amount of explanation about vocation shortages and financial constraints satisfied them. "We've been faithful members for decades," one man said, his voice rising with emotion. "We've given money, time, energy to this church. And now you're telling us our parish doesn't matter. Our community doesn't matter? Just deal with it and go somewhere else?" Michael tried to respond with patience and understanding, but he'd heard this same speech a dozen times in different forms. No one is saying your community doesn't matter. We're dealing with circumstances beyond any individual's control. There simply aren't enough priests to staff all the churches. Then ordain more priests. Train them faster. Bring back the ones who left. Do something other than closing churches and telling us to accept it. If I could ordain priests myself, I would, but that's not how it works. The vocations crisis is complex, rooted in cultural changes, and then change the culture. Make priesthood more appealing. Pay priests better. Let them marry. Do something instead of just managing the decline. The suggestion hung in the air. Married priests would potentially double or triple the pool of candidates. It was a solution the Eastern Catholic churches had used for centuries, and the Roman Church had maintained married priests in some contexts. But it wasn't Michael's decision to make. It required institutional change at the highest levels, and those levels seemed paralyzed by tradition and fear. "I don't have the authority to change canon law," Michael said carefully. "But I understand your frustration. I share it. Do you? Because from where we're sitting, you're part of the system that's failing us. You're wearing the collar, representing the institution that's abandoning us." The accusation stung because it was partially true. Michael was part of the institutional structure, even as he chafed against its limitations. He benefited from its authority, even as he witnessed its failures. He couldn't separate himself from it, couldn't claim innocence while participating in its operations. The meeting continued for another hour, generating heat but little light. Solutions were proposed and immediately dismissed as impractical. Complaints were voiced and acknowledged, but not resolved. By the end, everyone left frustrated, Michael included. He drove home through the dark city, feeling the weight of impossible expectations. Everyone wanted someone to fix the situation, but the fixes required either resources that didn't exist or institutional changes that weren't forthcoming. He was supposed to be a shepherd, but he had too many sheep scattered across too much territory. He was supposed to be a spiritual father, but he didn't have time to know his spiritual children. He was supposed to represent an eternal church, but he was watching it fracture in real time. Back at the rectory, Thomas was watching television news, some political scandal dominating the coverage. He muted the sound when Michael entered. How was the council meeting? About as good as you'd expect. Lots of anger, no solutions. Did they suggest married priests? Yeah. How do you know? Because every meeting eventually gets there. It's the obvious solution, which is why the church will never allow it. Too much admission of error. Too much disruption to the power structure. You think we should have married priests? Thomas shrugged. I think we should have whatever allows us to serve communities effectively. If that means married priests, fine. If it means more lay leadership, fine. If it means smaller, more flexible structures, fine. But none of that is going to happen, because institutions don't reform themselves willingly. They wait until crisis forces change, and even then they fight it. So we're just waiting for the crisis to get bad enough? We're already in crisis, Michael. It's just not distributed evenly yet. Some places are feeling it more than others. But eventually, the shortage will affect everyone, even the well-resourced parishes. And then, maybe we'll see real reform. Or maybe the whole thing will just collapse, and something new will grow from the ruins. The next few weeks followed exhausting pattern masses and meetings, counseling sessions and hospital visits, administrative tasks and emergency calls. Michael moved through his days with increasing detachment, performing duties out of obligation rather than inspiration. The vocational fire that had once burned bright now flickered weakly, starved of oxygen by the grinding demands of institutional maintenance. He began noticing other signs of systemic strain. The religious education program at St. Dominic's, Oz was hemorrhaging students as displaced families decided not to transfer their kids to an unfamiliar program. The youth group had dissolved completely when its moderator burned out from tripled responsibilities. The music program cycled through volunteers who quit after a few weeks, exhausted by the demands. The pastoral associate resigned, taking a job with better pay and fewer hours at a nonprofit. The church was cannibalizing itself, consuming its most dedicated members in a desperate attempt to maintain operations. Michael met Mrs. Kowalski again, by chance at the grocery store. She looked frailer than before, more diminished, as if the closing of her church had physically weakened her. He greeted her warmly, asked how she was doing. I'm managing, she said. I found a ride to St. Dominic's most Sundays. But it's not the same. I know it's been a difficult adjustment. That's what everyone keeps saying. Difficult adjustment. As if it's just a matter of getting used to it. But Father, I'm 86 years old. I don't have time for adjustments. I want to pray in my church before I die, but apparently that's too much to ask. I wish I could give you that. I really do. Can I tell you something honestly, Father? I think the church forgot what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a place where people can encounter God, where communities can gather, where ordinary people feel welcomed and known. Instead, it's become this big, complicated organization, more concerned about money and rules than about souls. And now it's falling apart because it built itself on the wrong foundation. Michael didn't know how to respond. Mrs. Kowalski's critique cut too close to his own doubts, articulated his own growing disillusionment with painful clarity. I haven't lost my faith, she continued. I still believe in God, still pray every day, still find meaning in the sacraments. But my faith in the institutional church, that's gone. And I don't think I'm alone. I think a lot of people are realizing that the church as an organization has failed us, even if the faith itself remains true. She shuffled away down the aisle, leaving Michael standing with his half-filled cart, her words echoing in his mind. He finished his shopping mechanically, drove home, put away groceries, all while her observation gnawed at him. The institutional church has failed us. How many people were thinking that exact thought? How many were separating faith from institution, deciding they could have one without the other? That Sunday, Michael looked out at the congregation during Mass and tried to see them clearly, not as an undifferentiated crowd, but as individuals, each with their own story of faith and doubt, commitment and disappointment. He saw families who'd been coming for generations, and young couples attending out of habit more than conviction. He saw elderly parishioners clinging to tradition and restless teenagers enduring services for their parents' sake. He saw belief and skepticism, hope and resignation, all mixed together in the same community. During the homily, instead of his prepared remarks, Michael found himself speaking more personally than usual. I know these have been challenging times for our community. The consolidation of parishes, the shortage of priests, the changes to familiar patterns, all of this has been disruptive and painful. And I won't stand here and pretend otherwise or tell you it is all part of some divine plan we can't understand. Sometimes the church makes mistakes. Sometimes we fail to serve you the way you deserve. Sometimes the institution prioritizes its own survival over the needs of the people it exists to serve. He could feel Thomas's surprised gaze from the side altar, could sense the congregation's attention sharpening. This wasn't the usual clerical reassurance. I don't have solutions to offer you. I wish I did. I wish I could promise that your churches will reopen, that everything will go back to how it was. But I can't make that promise. What I can tell you is that your faith matters more than any building. Your community matters more than any institutional structure. And if the church as an organization is failing you, that doesn't mean faith itself has failed. God is bigger than our institutions. The Holy Spirit moves beyond our control. And sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is admit that what we've built isn't working anymore and be open to something new. The silence after his words felt heavy. He'd probably overstepped, said too much, revealed too many doubts. He finished the Mass more conventionally, returning to the familiar liturgical script. But the damage, if it was damage, had been done. Afterward, the reaction split along predictable lines. Some parishioners thanked him for his honesty, said it was refreshing to hear a priest acknowledge institutional failures. Others looked troubled, unsettled by a clergyman expressing doubt rather than certainty. A few avoided him entirely, perhaps uncertain how to respond to such unvarnished truth. Thomas waited until they were alone in the sacristy to comment. That was quite a homily. Too much? Maybe. Or maybe exactly what needed saying. I'm honestly not sure. But you're going to get calls from the diocese about it. Let them call. I'm tired of pretending everything's fine when it obviously isn't. Be careful, Michael. Honest criticism is one thing. Undermining people's faith is another. I'm not undermining their faith. I'm questioning the institution. For a lot of people, those are the same thing. You separate them at your own risk. Thomas was right. Michael knew. For many Catholics, especially older ones, the institution and the faith were so intertwined as to be indistinguishable. Criticizing one felt like attacking the other. But the distinction mattered to Michael increasingly. He could believe in God, in Christ, in the essential truths of Christianity, while also acknowledging that the Catholic Church as an organization had serious problems that devotion and prayer alone wouldn't fix. The expected call from the diocese came 2 days later. Bishop Morrison's assistant politely requested Michael's presence for a conversation. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, leaving Michael a night and morning to anticipate the confrontation. He met with the bishop in an ornate office that spoke of institutional power and historical continuity. Bishop Morrison was in his late 60s, a career cleric who'd risen through diplomatic service and administrative positions. He greeted Michael warmly, but with an undercurrent of concern. I've been hearing about your recent homily, the bishop said, once they were settled. Some interesting observations about institutional failure. I spoke from my experience and what I'm seeing in the parishes. I understand that, and I appreciate honesty. But Michael, you have to be careful about creating scandal or undermining confidence in the church. With respect, Bishop, I think the scandal is the situation itself. Empty churches, exhausted priests, displaced parishioners. My homily just acknowledged what everyone's experiencing. But the way we frame these challenges matters. We can acknowledge difficulties while also maintaining hope and trust in God's providence. I did maintain hope. I said faith matters more than buildings, that God is bigger than our institutions. Yes, and that's precisely what concerns me. When you separate faith from institution too sharply, you risk suggesting people don't need the church, that they can be spiritual but not institutional Catholics. And historically, people who take that path tend to drift away entirely. Michael had expected this argument. It was the standard hierarchical response. To criticism, acknowledge problems in theory, while insisting any actual criticism threatens stability. The underlying assumption was that institutional loyalty mattered more than institutional honesty. Bishop, we have 17 closed churches in this city alone. We have 3 priests trying to serve populations that used to require 20. We have people like Mrs. Kowalski, who've been faithful members for 50 years, being told their parish doesn't matter anymore. If we don't address these realities honestly, we're just managing a long decline into irrelevance. I know the situation is difficult, but difficult times require leadership that strengthens rather than questions. The people need to know their shepherds believe in the church, even when circumstances are challenging. I do believe in the church, but I also believe the church is capable of failure, of making decisions that harm people, of prioritizing its own preservation over its mission. Pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. Bishop Morrison leaned back in his chair, regarding Michael with an expression that mixed disappointment and understanding. You're not the first priest to struggle with these tensions. Every generation faces them in different forms. And I won't tell you your concerns are invalid, but I will tell you that public expressions of doubt from clergy cause real harm. People look to us for stability and certainty, especially in unstable times. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've been offering false certainty when honest uncertainty would serve people better. That's a very Protestant way of thinking, Michael. Catholic ecclesiology emphasizes the church as a divinely guided institution, not just a human organization subject to normal failures. But it is a human organization, made up of human beings, making human decisions, subject to human limitations. The divine guidance doesn't override that reality. They continued in this vein for another 20 minutes, circling around fundamental disagreements about authority, tradition, and institutional responsibility. The bishop never directly ordered Michael to change his approach, but the message was clear. Tone down the criticism, emphasize positive aspects, maintain confidence in institutional structures. Be a good institutional man. Michael left the meeting feeling simultaneously validated and constrained. His concerns had been heard, but not really addressed, acknowledged, but not taken seriously. The bishop's primary worry wasn't whether the institution was failing people, but whether acknowledging that failure might accelerate the decline. It was a fundamentally defensive posture, focused on managing perception rather than addressing reality. Driving back to St. Dominic's, Michael passed 3 more closed churches. He pulled into the parking lot of Holy Name and sat looking at the building. It was a beautiful structure, Gothic Revival architecture with soaring spires and intricate stonework. Someone had loved this building enough to spend vast resources creating it. Generations of families had married here, baptized their children here, buried their dead here. And now it sat empty, slowly deteriorating, because the institutional structure couldn't sustain it. He got out of his car and walked around the perimeter. The grounds were overgrown, the parking lot cracked and weedy. Someone had broken a window in the parish hall. The statue of Mary near the entrance was stained with bird droppings. Neglect was visible everywhere. the building dying by increments. Michael tried the front doors, knowing they'd be locked, but checking anyway. Locked, as expected. He peered through the small windows set into the doors and could see the dark interior pews still in place, altar visible in the distance, stations of the cross mounted on the walls. Everything frozen, waiting for a congregation that wouldn't return. His phone buzzed with a text from Raymond. Emergency at hospital. Family requesting priest for dying mother. Can you cover? I'm stuck in meeting. Michael texted back his confirmation and headed to the hospital. Another deathbed visit. Another family in crisis. Another moment where priest as person mattered less than priest as function. He would go because it was his duty, would administer the sacrament because that's what dying Catholics expected, would comfort the family because that's what they needed. But the personal cost of being constantly available, constantly responsive, constantly performing the role, that cost was accumulating. The pattern continued through November and into December. The Christmas season brought its own pressures, increased mass schedules, decoration responsibilities, extra music programs, additional counseling as holidays stressed struggling families. Michael moved through the days operating on autopilot, his priestly identity becoming less a calling and more a job, less a vocation and more an occupation. On Christmas Eve, St. Dominic's was packed beyond capacity, people standing in aisles and gathering in doorways. The overflow crowd included many irregular attenders, people who showed up for Christmas and Easter out of cultural habit or family obligation. Michael looked at them and wondered what they saw. Did they notice the strain? Did they sense the underlying fragility? Or did the pageantry and tradition obscure the structural problems? The midnight mass proceeded with its usual blend of solemnity and celebration. Children in pageant costumes reenacted the Nativity. The choir sang traditional carols. Candles were lit and prayers were offered. For a few hours, everything felt right, felt like church was supposed to feel. The sanctuary was full, the mood was joyous, the liturgy was beautiful. But after the last parishioner left, and the candles were extinguished, and the decorations were secured for the next day services, Michael sat alone in the empty church and felt the hollowness return. This building would need to host 4 more masses tomorrow. Then regular services would resume with the same impossible demands. The Christmas uplift was temporary, a brief respite before the grinding reality reasserted itself. Father Thomas found him sitting in the darkened church an hour later. "You all right?" "Just thinking. Dangerous activity at this hour." Thomas sat down in the pew beside him. "What are you thinking about?" "Sustainability. Whether any of this is actually sustainable, or if we're just delaying inevitable collapse. Probably the latter, if I'm being honest. But we delay it anyway, because that's what we've been trained to do. That's what the institution demands. Do you ever think about leaving? Resigning from active ministry?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, more often lately. But I'm 62 years old. Where would I go? What would I do? This is the only life I've known for 40 years. I'm not sure I know how to be anything other than a priest anymore. Do you think that's healthy? Being so consumed by a role that you can't imagine existing outside it? Probably not. But that's the deal we made when we took vows. The church asks for everything, and we give it. And then we too invested to leave, even when we realized the bargain might not have been fair." They sat together in the silent church, 2 priests worn down by demands they couldn't meet, sustained by a vocation that was simultaneously fulfilling and crushing. Outside, the city slept, its closed churches dark and silent, their bells frozen, their communities scattered. January brought budget meetings and strategic planning sessions, where diocesan administrators presented plans for further consolidation. 2 more churches would close by summer. The 3-parish model would become a 2-parish model. St. Mark's would be shuttered and sold, its congregation absorbed by St. Dominic's and St. Jerome's, a church on the far side of the city. The announcement generated immediate backlash. St. Mark's parishioners organized protests, circulated petitions, threatened to withhold donations. They'd watched other parishes close and believed their vocal support would spare them. The diocese responded with financial data and vocational statistics, coldly demonstrating that maintaining St. Mark's was mathematically impossible. Michael attended a meeting where St. Mark's leadership made a final appeal to the bishop. Their arguments were passionate, but ultimately ineffective offers of increased fundraising, proposals for shared priest arrangements, suggestions of lay-led services between priest visits. The bishop listened politely and rejected everything. The decision was final. After the meeting, Michael spoke with Margaret Shun, the pastoral associate from St. Mark's. She'd been working in parish ministry for 15 years, had deep roots in the community, had watched her parish slowly suffocate under the weight of impossible circumstances. "What will you do?" Michael asked. "I don't know. There's no position for me at the consolidated parishes. The diocese is cutting staff as well as churches. I'll probably look for work outside church ministry, maybe nonprofit management or hospital chaplaincy. I'm sorry. You've been doing important work. Have I? Some days I wonder. I've been helping maintain a system that's fundamentally broken. Maybe it's time to step away and let it collapse so something better can emerge." "You sound like a former priest I met." Peter Walsh. He left in the 90s, says the same things about the institution needing to collapse. He might be right. Sometimes things need to end completely before they can be rebuilt properly. All our energy goes into preservation when it should go into reimagining. Margaret left and Michael remained, thinking about her words. Reimagining required admitting the current model had failed, accepting loss, grieving what wouldn't be recovered. The church seemed institutionally incapable of that kind of honest reckoning. February brought a cold snap that stressed the aging infrastructure at St. Dominic's. The boiler failed during a weekend, forcing cancellation of Sunday masses. The repair cost $15,000 that the parish didn't have in reserve. An emergency fundraising appeal generated enough to cover half, the rest coming from diocesan emergency funds that were themselves nearly depleted. In March, Raymond announced he was requesting reassignment to a different diocese. The pressure and dysfunction had broken his enthusiasm. He was going somewhere smaller, more manageable, where he might actually practice ministry rather than just manage crisis. "I'm sorry," he told Michael when sharing the news. "I thought I could handle it. I thought my energy and commitment would be enough. But I'm burning out after less than a year. That's not sustainable. No one would blame you for leaving. This situation would break anyone. The thing is, I still feel called to priesthood. Just not this version of it. Not this grinding administrative burden with inadequate support and impossible expectations. There has to be a better way. If you find it, let me know." Raymond left at the end of March, reducing the priest count from 3 to 2. The diocese promised a replacement, but couldn't provide a timeline. Michael and Thomas split Raymond's responsibilities between them, each taking additional masses and meetings and obligations. The wheel turned faster, demanding more while providing less. In April, Mrs. Kowalski died. Michael learned about it from her daughter, who called to request a funeral mass. Mrs. Kowalski had attended St. Dominic's irregularly in her final months, never fully adjusting to the displacement, never feeling at home in the unfamiliar space. She died quietly in her sleep, her rosary still clutched in her hand. The funeral was small, attended mostly by elderly women who had been part of Mrs. Kowalski's community at St. Catherine's. They sat together in a cluster, united by shared loss, mourning their friend, but also mourning the church that had been taken from them. Michael performed the service with genuine sadness. Mrs. Kowalski represented something important: faithful dedication across decades, the kind of steady commitment that sustained parishes through generations. Her death felt symbolic, marking the end of an era. At the burial, Her daughter approached Michael with an envelope. "My mother wanted you to have this. She wrote it a few weeks before she died." Michael opened the envelope later, alone in his car. The letter was written in shaky handwriting, Mrs. Kowalski's words wandering across the page. "Dear Father Michael, I am writing this because I won't be around much longer, and I want someone to know what I am thinking. I forgive the church for closing St. Catherine's. I know there weren't enough priests and not enough money. I understand the math even if I don't accept it. But what I can't forgive is the dishonesty. The way everyone pretended this was a temporary adjustment when it was really abandonment. The way they kept telling us to have faith when they already decided our parish didn't matter. I spent 53 years being faithful to an institution that wasn't faithful back. And I died without my church, without the community I helped build, without the sacred space where I'd planned to spend my final years. That's not what was promised when I committed my life to this faith. I'm not angry at you, Father. You're just trying to serve in an impossible situation. But someone needs to say out loud that the church has failed people like me. Someone needs to acknowledge that what is happening isn't God's will or divine providence, but human failure and institutional collapse. I hope that after I'm gone, you'll have the courage to speak that truth. The people deserve honesty, even if the institution can't provide it." Michael folded the letter carefully and sat with her words. Mrs. Kowalski had given him permission, even demanded that he acknowledge what everyone knew, but few would say clearly. The institutional church was failing its people. The structures were collapsing, and the official response was denial, delay, and defensive posturing rather than honest reckoning. That Sunday, Michael preached about Mrs. Kowalski. He read parts of her letter from the pulpit, her words carrying authority his own could never match. He spoke about institutional failure and the cost paid by faithful people. He talked about the need for honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. And he said clearly what had only been implied before. The current model of Catholic parish life was ending, and pretending otherwise served no one. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some parishioners expressed gratitude for his honesty. Others complained to the diocese about his inappropriate comments. The bishop called again, his tone less conciliatory this time. Michael was creating problems, undermining confidence, causing scandal. One more incident and there would be formal consequences. Michael listened to the bishop's concerns and felt something shift inside himself. He'd spent years trying to be a good priest within the system, accepting its constraints and working within its limitations. But the system was broken in ways that good intentions couldn't fix, and his continued participation was enabling dysfunction rather than serving community. "Bishop," he said carefully, "what if the scandal isn't my honesty, but our collective dishonesty? What if the real problem is that we keep asking people to trust an institution that's actively failing them? That's not your determination to make, Father. You took vows of obedience. You don't get to decide unilaterally what the church should be. I took vows to serve God and community. If those vows conflict with institutional loyalty, which takes precedence? They don't conflict if you maintain proper perspective. The church is the vehicle through which we serve God. Unless the vehicle is broken and driving us off a cliff." The bishop's frustration was evident. "I'm going to be direct with you, Michael. You're on a dangerous path. If you can't find a way to serve faithfully within the structure we have, you need to consider whether active ministry is right for you." The conversation ended shortly after, both men frustrated, no resolution reached. Michael drove home knowing he'd crossed a line. The bishop had essentially threatened him with removal from ministry if he didn't conform. And Michael wasn't sure he could conform, wasn't sure he wanted to. He talked to Thomas that evening, laying out the conversation and its implications. "So what are you going to do?" Thomas asked. "I don't know. Keep doing what I'm doing and risk getting removed? Or fall in line and become part of the problem?" False dichotomy. You can be honest about problems while still working within the system. You don't have to choose between total compliance and total rebellion. But the system doesn't want honesty, Thomas. It wants compliance dressed up as honesty. It wants me to acknowledge problems in ways that don't threaten institutional stability. Welcome to institutional life. That's how large organizations work. They privilege stability over truth, continuity over change. And that doesn't bother you? Of course it bothers me. But I made my peace with it decades ago. You can be effective within constraints if you're re-strategic about when to push and when to accommodate. I'm tired of being strategic. I'm tired of managing my truth to accommodate institutional comfort. Thomas regarded him seriously. Then you might need to leave, Michael. Not because you're wrong, but because the institution won't change to accommodate you. And you burning yourself out trying to force change helps no one. The suggestion sat heavy between them. Leaving active ministry felt like failure, like abandoning the vocation he'd committed to, like proving the doubters right. But staying was becoming untenable, grinding him down, transforming him into something bitter and exhausted. Over the following weeks, Michael found himself imagining life outside active ministry. He thought about Peter Walsh, the former priest who'd left in the 90s, and seemed at peace with his decision. He thought about Margaret Shawn, transitioning to nonprofit work. He thought about all the people who'd left the institutional church while maintaining their faith, finding spiritual community in different forms. The idea grew from speculation to serious consideration. He researched the process for requesting leave from active ministry, read accounts from other priests who'd made similar transitions, reached out quietly to a few who might understand. The responses were encouraging. Most said leaving had been difficult, but ultimately liberating, allowing them to serve in ways the institutional structure had prevented. In June, as the church year wound toward summer, Michael requested a meeting with the bishop, not to be reprimanded this time, but to initiate a conversation about his future. He'd prepared his thoughts carefully, knowing this decision would define the rest of his life. Bishop, I've been doing a lot of reflection about my vocation and my capacity to serve within the current structure. And I've come to believe that I need to request a leave from active ministry. The bishop's expression registered surprise. This is sudden. Is this because of our previous conversations? Partially, but it's mostly about my own limitations. I can't continue serving in a system that requires me to be dishonest about what I am seeing. I can't keep participating in institutional dysfunction while it harms people. And I can't keep sacrificing my own integrity to maintain structures that aren't working. So, you're abandoning your vows because things are difficult? I'm not abandoning my vows. I am recognizing that the way we currently structure priestly ministry makes it impossible for me to fulfill those vows authentically. I still feel called to serve God and community. But I need to find ways to do that outside the institutional priesthood as it currently exists. They talked for over an hour, the bishop alternating between trying to change Michael's mind and accepting his decision. Eventually, they agreed on a timeline. Michael would continue through the summer to allow for transition planning, then officially request laicization in September. He'd remain a Catholic, maintain his faith, but no longer function as a priest. The announcement to the parish was difficult. Michael explained his decision carefully, emphasizing that he wasn't leaving the faith, but rather finding a different way to serve. The reactions ranged from supportive to devastated. Some people felt abandoned. Others understood and respected his honesty. A few seemed relieved, perhaps recognizing the unsustainability of his situation. Father Thomas took the news hardest. I can't say I'm surprised, but I hoped you'd find a way to stay. I couldn't, Thomas. Not without destroying myself in the process. So, I'll be alone now. One priest for 2 large parishes. The math just keeps getting worse. I'm sorry. I know this makes your situation harder. It's not your responsibility to sacrifice yourself for a broken system. I understand that intellectually. Emotionally, it's harder. They sat together in the familiar silence of two people who'd shared impossible burdens. Michael knew his leaving would increase pressure on Thomas, would make an already difficult situation more strained. But he also knew he couldn't stay just to ease someone else's burden. That path led only to resentment and burnout. His final months in active ministry passed with surprising calm. Freed from the need to pretend everything was fine, Michael spoke more honestly with parishioners about institutional challenges. He encouraged lay leadership development, supported community organizing around parish needs, emphasized the church happened wherever people gathered in faith rather than just in official liturgies. Some of his final homilies were his most powerful, unfiltered by institutional caution. He talked about courage to admit failure, about choosing integrity over comfort, about faithfulness that transcended institutional form. The responses were mixed, but genuine. People appreciated the honesty, even when it unsettled them. On his last Sunday in September, Michael celebrated a final Mass at St. Dominic's. The church was full, people coming to mark the occasion, to say goodbye, to witness this transition. He looked out at the congregation and saw the complicated reality of Catholic community faithful people trying to sustain spiritual practice amid institutional collapse, holding together what they could while grieving what they'd lost. In his final homily, he spoke about Mrs. Kowalski, about her letter, about her faithful challenge to choose honesty over institutional comfort. He talked about the 17 closed churches sitting empty across the city, about the people displaced and scattered, about the system grinding down priests and parishioners alike. And he said what he'd come to believe through this experience, that the institutional Catholic Church was in the midst of a historic collapse, that the parish model developed over centuries was ending, and that what emerged afterward might be smaller, but could be more authentic. "I don't know what comes next," he concluded. "Not for me personally, and not for the church as an institution. But I know that faith survives structures. Community transcends buildings, and the Spirit moves in ways we can't control or predict. So I leave you with this. Don't confuse institution with faith. Don't let organizational failure destroy your connection to the sacred. And don't be afraid to imagine and create new forms of religious community when the old forms can no longer sustain you." After Mass, people lingered for hours. Conversations happened in small groups, people processing what they'd heard and what it meant. Some were angry, feeling abandoned by another priest leaving. Others were thoughtful, contemplating their own relationship to institutional church. A few seemed liberated, as if Michael's departure gave them permission to reimagine their own participation. Michael changed out of his vestments for the final time, the ritual feeling both ordinary and momentous. He folded the alb carefully, placed it in the sacristy cabinet, removed his collar. The physical symbols of priesthood set aside, he felt lighter and more uncertain simultaneously. Father Thomas met him in the parking lot as Michael loaded his belongings into his car. They'd said their private goodbyes already, but this public parting felt significant. "What will you do?" Thomas asked. "I'm not entirely sure. I've been offered a position with a nonprofit working on community development. It's not ministry in the traditional sense, but it serves people, addresses needs. That feels right for now. And spiritually, I'll figure it out. Maybe find a small faith community, people gathering informally. Maybe help start something new. The form matters less than the substance. You're braver than me, Michael, or more foolish. I'm not sure which. Maybe both, but staying was killing something in me. I had to choose life, even if that meant leaving." They embraced briefly, two men who'd shared impossible burdens. Then Michael drove away from St. Dominic's for the last time as its priest. He passed St. Catherine's on his way home, the church still locked and silent. He passed Holy Name and St. Joseph's, St. Mark's and the others, all the broken bells and closed doors, the visible evidence of institutional failure. But he also saw something else: small groups gathering in homes for prayer, informal Bible studies in coffee shops, community service projects organized outside official church structures. People finding ways to maintain faith and community despite institutional collapse. The church, in some new and still forming sense, continuing to exist in spaces the institution didn't control. 3 months after leaving active ministry, Michael attended a gathering at Peter Walsh's house. It was an informal communion service led by lay people, combining Catholic liturgical elements with more flexible structure. About 20 people attended, a mix of former Catholics and current ones, people seeking spiritual community outside official channels. The experience was both familiar and strange. Familiar prayers and rituals performed in someone's living room rather than a sanctuary. Communion shared with real bread and wine rather than altar bread and communion wine. Discussion and reflection replacing formal homily. It lacked the grandeur and tradition of official liturgy, but held something else: intimacy, authenticity, direct participation. Afterward, people lingered over coffee and conversation. Michael met Sarah, a former parishioner from St. Catherine, who'd stopped attending after it closed, but still considered herself Catholic. She told him about starting a neighborhood group for faith sharing, about 15 people who gathered weekly to discuss Scripture and support each other spiritually. "We're not trying to replace the church," she explained, "but we needed something when the church wasn't available. So we created it ourselves. And honestly, it's been more meaningful than most masses I attended. More personal, more honest." Michael heard similar stories from others: people adapting, improvising, creating new forms of religious community when official structures failed them. It was happening quietly, under the radar, unauthorized but authentic. The institutional church was dying, but something was being born in its ruins. "Do you miss it?" Peter Walsh asked later in the evening. "Being a priest? I miss some aspects. The ritual, the sense of purpose, being part of something larger than myself. But I don't miss the dishonesty, the exhaustion, the grinding institutional demands. I'm finding that I can still serve, still participate in spiritual community, just in different forms." The hardest part, Peter said, is accepting that the institutional church won't change in our lifetimes, that the collapse has to complete before anything genuinely new can emerge. We're living in the end times of a particular model of church, and that's painful to witness, but also necessary. Maybe the current structure is unsustainable, built for a cultural moment that's past. Better to let it die than prop it up indefinitely, while it does increasing damage to people who depend on it. Michael thought about Mrs. Kowalski, about the elderly woman who died without her church, about all the people scattered and displaced by institutional failure. Their pain was real, their losses genuine. But Peter was right that preserving a dying system just prolonged the suffering. 6 months after leaving, Michael had found a rhythm in his new life. He worked with the nonprofit, focusing on community development and social services. He participated in Peter's home church group and Sarah's neighborhood gathering. He maintained friendships with people from his priesthood years. He dated, exploring relationship possibilities he'd long denied himself. Life had texture and complexity that vocation had sometimes obscured. He stayed informed about developments in the diocese. St. Jerome's had closed, leaving only St. Dominic's operating. Father Thomas had been joined by a retired priest who helped with weekend masses but couldn't handle full ministry. The archdiocese was openly discussing bankruptcy, the result of legal settlements and declining revenue. More closures and consolidations were inevitable. But Michael also saw green shoots of something new. More home churches forming, more informal faith communities, more people finding ways to maintain spiritual practice outside institutional structures. It was decentralized and chaotic and lacking official approval. It was also vital and authentic in ways official church often wasn't. One evening, Michael received a call from Thomas. I wanted you to hear this from me directly. I'm retiring. Effective end of summer. I'm sorry to hear that. How are you doing? Exhausted, relieved, ready to step away. I gave the church 40 years. That's enough. What will you do? Travel, probably. Visit family. Maybe do some supply priest work, celebrating masses occasionally when they need someone. But no more full-time ministry. I don't have it in me anymore. I understand completely. The diocese is talking about closing St. Dominic's too. No priests to staff it, no money to maintain it. They'll probably designate one building as the official church for the entire region and call everything else mission stations with occasional visiting priests. The parish model is dead, Michael. You saw it coming before most of us. After the call ended, Michael sat with that information. The parish model stable faith communities, anchored by resident priests in local churches, was indeed dying. What had seemed permanent and divinely ordained was revealed as contingent and temporary, a particular organizational form suited to particular historical circumstances. But faith persisted, community persisted, the sacred persisted. They just weren't contained by the forms that had held them for so long. A year after leaving active ministry, Michael attended an evening gathering at Sarah's house. 25 people now participated regularly, more than in the original group. They'd developed a rhythm weekly scripture study, monthly shared meals, occasional service projects. It had organic structure without institutional rigidity. During the gathering, a woman named Rachel shared that she'd been exploring a call to ministry. Not priesthood in the institutional sense, but spiritual leadership in their community. She'd been reading theology, attending workshops, developing her capacity to lead prayer and teach. The group had affirmed her call and started organizing around her leadership. Michael watched this happen and saw the future, not one priest serving many people, but many people serving each other. Leadership emerging from community rather than institutional appointment. It was messier than the old model, less controlled, harder to sustain across generations. But it was also more democratic, more adaptable, more responsive to actual needs. After the gathering, Michael walked home through the dark city. He passed what had been Holy Name Church, now converted into condominiums. He passed what had been St. Joseph's, currently sitting empty with a for sale sign in front. He passed what had been St. Catherine's, recently purchased by a developer who planned to turn it into a restaurant and event space. The physical structures that had held Catholic community for generations were being repurposed, their sacred function ending, their buildings taking on new secular purposes. It felt like loss and liberation simultaneously, the ending of one story and the beginning of another not yet fully written. Michael thought about Mrs. Kowalski's letter, her demand for honesty about institutional failure. He'd tried to honor that demand, had paid a professional price for doing so. But he'd also found something more valuable: integrity, authenticity, alignment between his beliefs and his actions. He'd chosen truth over comfort, and while that choice had cost him his priesthood, it had given him something more important: himself. The church as he'd known it was dying. The institutional structures were collapsing. The parish model was ending. But the faith those structures had attempted to contain had remained alive, adapting to new forms, finding new expressions. The bells might be broken, the churches might be empty, but the community persisted. Not in buildings or institutions, but in people gathering, praying, serving, believing together. Somewhere in the city, small groups were meeting in homes and coffee shops. Somewhere people were discovering that faith didn't require priests or buildings. That community could emerge without institutional authorization. Somewhere the future church was being born, small and fragile and genuine, built on honesty rather than pretense, on participation rather than hierarchy, on love rather than obligation. Michael reached his apartment and looked back at the dark skyline. The church spires still visible against the night sky, but their lights extinguished, their bells silent. He thought about all the priests still serving in impossible conditions, all the faithful people trying to maintain practice amid institutional collapse, all the scattered communities seeking ways to stay connected to sacred tradition while the structures that carried that tradition crumbled. And he thought about new possibilities, communities not yet formed, leadership not yet recognized, structures not yet imagined. The institutional church was dying, but something was being born. What exactly? No one yet knew. But in homes and gatherings across the city, people were experimenting, trying, failing, learning, slowly discovering what faith looked like when freed from the weight of failing institutions. The broken bells would not ring again. The churches would not reopen. The old model would not return. But somewhere in the ruins, shoots of new life were pushing through the rubble, green and tender and determined to grow. The church, in some new form still emerging, continued. Not despite the collapse, but perhaps because of it. Freed finally to become something it had always potentially been, a people rather than an institution, a community rather than a structure, a living faith rather than an organizational form. Michael went inside, leaving the dark churches behind, carrying forward the faith they'd once held, no longer certain what tomorrow would bring, but finally, genuinely, honestly faithful to the call he'd first heard all those years ago, to serve, to love, to bear witness to the sacred in whatever forms it took, whether those forms were sanctioned by institutions or born in living rooms, whether they came with official approval or emerged from necessity and imagination. The ending had begun. What came next remained unwritten. But whatever it was, it would be built by people choosing truth over comfort, community over institution, faith over structure. And that felt like the beginning of something genuine, something authentic, something worth building even as the old world fell away and the bells, broken and silent, marked the passing of an age that would not return.